The first cut was made at dawn. In the spring of 1852, in Albemarle County, Virginia, Dr. Nathaniel Hargrove stood in the surgical room of his plantation manor, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was about to attempt. Outside, the tobacco field stretched green and endless under a pale morning sky. Inside, the air smelled of carbolic acid and fear. Two bodies lay on separate tables, one breathing, one soon to stop. The doctor's son on the left, an enslaved man named Samuel on the right. Nathaniel Hargrove was 43 years old, a physician trained at the University of Pennsylvania, a man who had returned to Virginia with knowledge and ambition. He had inherited Ashford Plantation from his father 10 years earlier, along with 62 enslaved people who worked the land and maintained the household. Nathaniel practiced medicine in Charlottesville 3 days a week, treating patients from across the county. The rest of his time was spent at Ashford, conducting research, reading medical journals from Europe, and raising his only child. His son William was 19 years old, tall and slender, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's serious disposition. William had been suffering from a congenital heart defect since birth, a weakness in the organ that caused breathlessness, fatigue, and episodes of severe chest pain. Multiple physicians had examined him over the years. All had given the same prognosis. William would not live to see 25. Most believed he wouldn't reach 21. Nathaniel had spent the last 5 years searching for a solution. He had read everything available about cardiac anatomy, studied the work of French physiologists who were beginning to understand the heart's function, and corresponded with surgeons in Philadelphia and London. Heart surgery was virtually unknown in 1852. The organ was considered untouchable, sacred, beyond the reach of surgical intervention. Most physicians believed that opening the chest cavity meant certain death, but Nathaniel was desperate, and desperation made men willing to attempt the impossible. Samuel was 24 years old, born on Ashford Plantation to parents who had also been enslaved there. He was strong and healthy, valued for his work in the blacksmith shop, where he repaired tools and forged iron. He had a wife named Esther and a daughter named Ruth, both of whom lived in the quarters near the main house. Samuel was known for his quiet competence, his skill with metal, and his ability to fix things others couldn't. 3 weeks earlier, Samuel had been summoned to the main house. Dr. Hargrove had examined him thoroughly, listening to his heart, checking his lungs, measuring his pulse. Samuel had stood silently, understanding that enslaved people had no right to question what their owners did. When the examination was finished, Nathaniel had told him something that changed everything. "Your heart is perfect," the doctor had said, "and my son needs a perfect heart to survive." Samuel had understood immediately. He had heard stories, whispered among the enslaved community, about medical experiments, about doctors using enslaved bodies for research and practice. He knew about the physicians in Montgomery who operated on enslaved women without anesthesia, developing techniques they would later use on white patients. He knew that enslaved people had no legal protection, no right to refuse, no control over their own bodies. "When?" Samuel had asked quietly. "Soon," Nathaniel had replied. "I need time to prepare." Samuel had returned to his cabin that night and held his wife. He told her what was coming. Esther had wept silently, her hands pressed against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of the heart that would soon be taken from him. Ruth, only 3 years old, had slept peacefully in the corner, unaware that her father was about to disappear forever. Now, in the surgical room, Samuel lay unconscious on the table. Nathaniel had administered chloroform, a relatively new anesthetic that had been used successfully in surgeries since the late 1840s. Samuel would feel nothing during the procedure. He would simply drift away, his life ending while he slept. On the other table, William lay partially sedated, awake enough to understand what was happening, but calm enough not to panic. His chest had been prepared, washed with carbolic solution, marked with ink where the incisions would be made. Nathaniel had 2 assistants, Dr. Marcus Webb, a colleague from Charlottesville, and Thomas Payne, a medical student who had agreed to help despite his reservations about the procedure. Both men understood the gravity of what they were attempting. Both knew it would likely fail, but Nathaniel believed. He had to believe. because the alternative was watching his son die slowly over the coming months, gasping for air, clutching his chest in pain, fading away one breath at a time. He picked up the scalpel, its blade catching the morning light streaming through the window. He looked at Samuel's chest, at the spot where he would make the first incision, and then, with the steady hand of a man who had cut into flesh 1,000 times before, he began. The surgery that would haunt Virginia for decades had started. Blood came quickly. Nathaniel worked with practiced precision, his scalpel moving through Samuel's skin and muscle in deliberate strokes. The human chest was a fortress designed to protect its most vital contents, and breaking through required both knowledge and force. He cut through the pectoralis major, separated the ribs with a specialized retractor, and exposed the pericardium, the thin sac surrounding the heart. Dr. Webb stood beside him, using cotton cloths to absorb the blood that pooled in the surgical field. Thomas Paine monitored Samuel's breathing, watching for any sign of distress, though they all knew the chloroform would keep him unconscious until the end. The room was silent except for the sound of instruments clicking against metal trays and the heavy breathing of men engaged in something no one had successfully attempted before. Nathaniel had studied cardiac anatomy obsessively. He knew the heart's chambers, its valves, the great vessels that carried blood to and from the organ. He had dissected animal hearts, had examined human hearts during autopsies, had drawn detailed diagrams in his notebooks. But this was different. This was a living heart, beating steadily beneath his hands, pumping blood through a body that would soon cease to exist. He opened the pericardium carefully. Samuel's heart lay exposed, a muscular organ roughly the size of a fist, contracting rhythmically. It was beautiful in its efficiency, each beat pushing blood through the body, sustaining life with mechanical perfection. Nathaniel felt a moment of profound respect for the organ and for the man whose body contained it. Then he reached for the clamps. The procedure he had designed required stopping Samuel's heart, removing it from his chest, and quickly transferring it to William before the organ deteriorated beyond use. Medical literature suggested that a heart could survive outside the body for perhaps 15 to 20 minutes if kept cool and handled carefully. Nathaniel had ice packed in containers near the surgical table. He had prepared solutions to keep the organ viable. He had rehearsed every step in his mind 100 times. He clamped the major vessels, the aorta, the pulmonary artery, the venae cavae. Samuel's heart continued beating for a few moments, then slowed, then stopped. The body on the table went still. Samuel was dead. Thomas Paine turned away, his face pale. Dr. Webb remained focused, assisting as Nathaniel severed the vessels and carefully lifted the heart from Samuel's chest. It was heavier than Nathaniel had expected, solid and dense with muscle. He placed it immediately in a basin of cold saline solution, watching as the organ maintained its shape, waiting to be transplanted. "Now," Nathaniel said, his voice tight, "we move quickly." They turned to William, who lay watching with wide, terrified eyes. His father approached, carrying instruments still stained with Samuel's blood. "Father," William whispered, "is he—" "Don't think about that now," Nathaniel interrupted. "Focus on breathing. This will save you." William closed his eyes as the chloroform mask was placed over his face. Within moments he was unconscious. Nathaniel made the first incision in his son's chest, moving with the same precision he had used on Samuel. But his hands were less steady now. This was his child, his only son, the boy he had raised, taught, loved more than anything in the world. Dr. Webb noticed the tremor in Nathaniel's hands. "Do you want me to continue?" he asked quietly. "No," Nathaniel said firmly. "I'll do it." He opened William's chest, exposing a heart that was visibly diseased. The organ was enlarged, its contractions weak and irregular. Even to Nathaniel's trained eye, it was clear this heart was failing. Without intervention, William had months at best, perhaps only weeks. Nathaniel clamped the vessels as he had with Samuel, stopping his son's heart. For a terrible moment, William's body lay as still as Samuel's had. Two young men, both motionless, both balanced on the edge between life and death. The room felt suspended in time, held in place by the magnitude of what was happening. Then Nathaniel removed William's diseased heart and reached for Samuel's. The transplant itself was technically complex, but conceptually simple. He had to connect Samuel's heart to William's circulatory system, matching vessels, suturing with silk thread, ensuring no leaks that would cause fatal bleeding. His hands moved automatically, guided by years of surgical training and countless hours of preparation. The aorta first, connecting the main artery that would carry blood from the new heart to William's body, then the pulmonary artery, which would send blood to the lungs for oxygenation. Finally, the venae cavae, returning oxygen-depleted blood back to the heart. Each connection required multiple sutures, each stitch placed with microscopic precision. Time seemed to both race and crawl. Nathaniel was aware of Dr. Webb monitoring William's condition, checking for signs of deterioration. Thomas Paine had returned to the room, assisting despite his obvious discomfort. The morning sun had risen higher, casting longer shadows across the surgical tables. After what felt like hours, but was perhaps 30 minutes, the connections were complete. Samuel's heart sat in William's chest, motionless and waiting. Nathaniel removed the clamps from the major vessels, allowing blood to flow back into the organ. Nothing happened. The heart remained still. William's body showed no signs of life. Dr. Webb checked for a pulse and found none. Nathaniel felt panic rising in his chest. He had killed Samuel for nothing. His son would die here on this table, and Samuel's death would be meaningless, wasted, a crime without even the justification of success. He pressed his hands against the transplanted heart and pushed, trying to manually stimulate contractions. Once, twice, 3 times. Dr. Webb watched in silence, knowing there was nothing more they could do. Then, on the 4th compression, the heart twitched. It was barely perceptible, just a slight movement of muscle. But Nathaniel felt it beneath his palms. He pressed again and the heart responded more strongly. Again and it contracted on its own. Then again, and again. Samuel's heart began to beat in William's chest. The first 24 hours were critical. William survived the surgery. Against all probability, against the expectations of everyone in that room, his body accepted the transplanted heart. By evening of that first day, he was breathing on his own. By midnight, he was conscious enough to drink water. By morning, he was speaking in whispers, asking questions his father couldn't fully answer. Nathaniel never left his son's side during those first crucial hours. He monitored William's pulse constantly, checking for signs of rejection or infection or any of the countless complications that could still prove fatal. Dr. Webb remained at Ashford Plantation for 3 days, helping to manage the recovery. Thomas Paine departed the morning after the surgery, pale and shaken, making Nathaniel promise never to reveal his involvement. In the quarters, Esther waited for Samuel to return. She waited through the morning, through the afternoon, into the evening. When night fell and he still hadn't come, she knew. She held Ruth close and wept silently, understanding that her husband was gone. No one from the main house came to explain. No one offered condolences. Samuel simply disappeared, as enslaved people often did, their absence noted, but rarely mourned by those who owned them. The next morning, Overseer James Crawford summoned Esther to his office. He was a hard man, efficient in his management of the plantation's enslaved workforce, indifferent to their suffering. He told her Samuel had died during a medical procedure. He offered no details. He gave her 1 day to grieve, then expected her back at work. Esther didn't ask questions. She knew better. Enslaved people who asked too many questions invited trouble. She returned to her cabin, held her daughter, and tried to explain that Ruth's father wouldn't be coming home. The child was too young to fully understand. She kept asking when Daddy would return, and Esther had no answer that made sense. Word spread quietly through the enslaved community. Samuel was dead. Dr. Hargrove had taken something from him. His heart, the whispers said. Used it for some experiment, some medical procedure involving his son. The details were unclear, but the fundamental truth was obvious. Samuel's life had been sacrificed so William could live. The reaction among the enslaved population was complicated. There was anger, of course, deep, burning anger at the injustice of it, at Samuel's murder dressed up as medical necessity. But there was also resignation. This was the reality of enslavement. Their bodies weren't their own. They could be bought, sold, bred, or used for medical experimentation at their owner's discretion. Samuel's death was horrifying but not surprising. Some of the enslaved people at Ashford began avoiding William. When he was well enough to sit on the porch, recovering in the spring sunshine, they would glance at him and quickly look away. They saw Samuel's heart beating in his chest, saw their friend's life sustaining someone who had done nothing to deserve it, and they didn't know how to reconcile the horror of it. William himself was troubled by dreams. In his semi-conscious state during recovery, he experienced vivid nightmares, memories that didn't belong to him, emotions he couldn't explain. He dreamed of working in the blacksmith shop, of hands calloused from handling hot metal. He dreamed of a woman's face, beautiful and sad, and a small child laughing. He woke gasping, his father's hand on his shoulder, being told it was just the lingering effects of chloroform. But William wasn't sure. Something felt different inside him, something that wasn't purely physical. By the end of the first week, it was clear the surgery had been technically successful. William was growing stronger each day. His breathing was easier, his color better. The weak, struggling heart that had plagued him since birth had been replaced by an organ that functioned perfectly. Samuel's heart was keeping him alive with ruthless efficiency. Nathaniel was both elated and haunted. He had saved his son's life, achieved something no surgeon had successfully accomplished before. But the cost weighed on him. He found himself thinking about Samuel, about the man's family, about the choice he had made to sacrifice one life for another. Dr. Webb visited Ashford 2 weeks after the surgery. He examined William thoroughly, checking the surgical site for infection, listening to the transplanted heart, testing reflexes and circulation. Everything appeared normal. William was recovering remarkably well. "It's extraordinary," Webb said quietly, standing with Nathaniel on the porch while William rested inside. "I didn't think it would work." "Neither did I," Nathaniel admitted. "I was prepared for failure." "What will you do now?" Webb asked. "This changes everything. This is medical history, Nathaniel. This is the kind of discovery that gets written about, that gets taught in medical schools." Nathaniel was silent for a long moment, watching the tobacco fields where enslaved workers moved through the rows. "I can't publish this," he finally said. Webb looked at him sharply. "What do you mean you can't publish it? This is groundbreaking work." "Think about what it means," Nathaniel said. "I took a healthy heart from an enslaved man and put it in my son. I killed someone to save someone else. How do you think that will be received? In the North, they're calling us barbarians for maintaining slavery. This would confirm everything they believe about us. But the medical implications don't matter," Nathaniel interrupted. "Not compared to the political implications. This procedure requires taking organs from living people. It requires having a population of individuals whose bodies can be used without their consent. The only reason I could attempt this was because Samuel had no legal right to refuse." Webb understood immediately. "So this stays secret?" "It has to," Nathaniel said. "For William's sake, for my reputation, for all of us." They stood in silence, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. Inside the house, William slept peacefully, Samuel's heart beating steadily in his chest. In the quarters, Esther tried to explain to her daughter why Daddy was never coming home. And in his study, Nathaniel sat down and wrote detailed notes about the procedure, recording every step, every complication, every observation. He locked the notes in a drawer, knowing they would never be published, never be shared, never contribute to medical knowledge the way they should. The surgery that could have changed medicine remained hidden, buried beneath layers of secrecy and shame, its success as troubling as its method. Summer arrived with oppressive heat. By June, William was strong enough to walk without assistance. The surgical wound had healed cleanly, leaving a long scar across his chest that he kept hidden beneath his shirts. His father had taught him to tell people he'd recovered from his heart condition naturally, that rest and proper diet had improved his health. Most people accepted this explanation. A few were skeptical, but no one pressed the issue. William found himself changed in ways that went beyond physical health. He felt stronger, more vigorous than he'd ever been in his life. But he also felt a strange disconnect from his own body, as if he were inhabiting something that didn't entirely belong to him. The sensation was difficult to explain, even to his father. It was like wearing clothes that fit perfectly, but felt foreign against the skin. The dreams continued. Every night, William experienced fragments of memories that made no sense. He saw the interior of the blacksmith shop, felt the weight of a hammer in his hand, heard the ring of metal against metal. He saw Esther's face, felt love and longing that seemed to come from somewhere deep within Samuel's heart. He heard a child's laughter and felt protective tenderness that had nothing to do with his own experiences. He didn't tell his father about these dreams. Nathaniel was already burdened enough by what he'd done. William understood with increasing clarity that someone had died so he could live. His father had killed an enslaved man and harvested his heart like farmers harvested tobacco. The knowledge sat in William's chest alongside Samuel's heart, heavy and impossible to ignore. One afternoon in late June, William encountered Esther near the main house. She was hanging laundry, her movements efficient and automatic. Ruth played nearby, chasing a chicken through the grass. William stopped watching them, feeling something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with cardiac function. "Esther," he said quietly. She turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Yes, Master William?" The title felt wrong in his ears. He wanted to tell her he was sorry that he hadn't asked for this, that Samuel's death haunted him. But what could he say? What words could possibly address the enormity of what had been taken from her? He started, then stopped. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can do for you and your daughter?" Esther's eyes met his for just a moment. In that brief glance, William saw grief and rage and resignation all mixed together. Then she looked away, her expression smoothing back into careful blankness. "No, sir," she said. "We're managing." William nodded and walked away, feeling Samuel's heart beating in his chest, wondering if the organ carried memories, if pieces of Samuel's consciousness had somehow transferred along with his flesh. The notion was scientifically absurd, of course. Nathaniel had explained that the heart was merely a pump, that consciousness resided in the brain, that whatever William was experiencing was psychological rather than physiological. But William wasn't entirely convinced. The dreams were too vivid, too specific. They felt like memories borrowed from someone else's life. In July, a physician from Richmond visited Ashford Plantation. Dr. Edmund Chase was an old friend of Nathaniel's, a respected surgeon who had heard rumors about William's miraculous recovery. He arrived unannounced, curious to examine the young man who had supposedly overcome a congenital heart defect. Nathaniel was forced to allow the examination, though he did so with visible discomfort. Dr. Chase listened to William's heart, checked his pulse, examined the scar on his chest. He said nothing during the examination, but his expression grew increasingly troubled. Afterward, he spoke privately with Nathaniel in the study. William listened from outside the door, pressing his ear against the wood. "That's not his heart," Chase said bluntly. "The rhythm is wrong, the sounds are different. I've examined William before, Nathaniel. I know what his heart sounded like. What's in his chest now is someone else's organ." There was a long silence. Then Nathaniel's voice, quiet but steady. "Yes." "Good God," Chase whispered. "What have you done?" "I saved my son's life. By taking someone else's." "Nathaniel, do you understand what this means? Do you understand the implications?" "I understand perfectly," Nathaniel said. "And I'm asking you, as my friend, to keep this confidential." "Whose heart is it?" Chase demanded. "Where did you get it?" Another silence. Then, "One of the enslaved men here, Samuel. He was healthy, his heart was perfect. William needed a perfect heart." "So, you just took it? You murdered him and harvested his organs like he was livestock?" "He was property," Nathaniel said, his voice hardening. "Legally, I had every right." "Legal right doesn't make it moral," Chase shot back. "This is monstrous, Nathaniel. Even by the standards of our time, this is beyond acceptable." "Would you have let your son die if you could save him?" Nathaniel asked. "Would you have stood by and watched while he suffocated slowly, knowing you had the skill and means to prevent it?" Chase had no answer. William heard footsteps pacing. heard the clink of glass as someone poured a drink. Finally, Chase spoke again, his voice heavy with resignation. "I won't tell anyone," he said. "But not for your sake, for William's. That boy doesn't deserve to carry this burden publicly. But you need to understand, Nathaniel, you've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. What you've done will follow you and your family forever." Dr. Chase left that evening. William watched from his window as the carriage departed, carrying with it one more person who knew the truth, one more person sworn to secrecy about the heart beating in his chest. That night William dreamed again, but this time the dream was different. He stood in the blacksmith shop, Samuel's hands holding a piece of hot metal. Esther approached, her face worried. "The doctor wants to see you," she said. Samuel understood immediately what that meant. He set down his tools and followed her to the main house, knowing he wouldn't return. William woke with tears on his face, Samuel's fear and resignation echoing through him. He pressed his hand against his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat of a heart that had once belonged to a man who never had a choice. A man who had been murdered so William could live. And for the first time since the surgery, William wondered if survival was worth this price. The first whispers began in town. By late summer of 1852, word had travelled quietly from Ashford Plantation into Charlottesville and the surrounding farms. No one outside the house knew the truth, not in its full terrible shape. But rumours rarely needed accuracy to grow. They only needed a spark. And the spark was simple. Samuel had died suddenly under Dr. Hargrove's hand, and almost at the same time, William Hargrove had risen from the edge of death into improbable health. In the dry goods store, men spoke in low voices about experiments on the plantation. At the barber's chair, a farmer mentioned that Hargrove's boy, who had been sickly since he was small, now walked like a soldier and rode his horse at full gallop. At the tavern, after a few drinks, someone said they'd heard a Negro's heart had been cut out for the doctor's son. Laughter followed, quick and nervous, as if the men wanted to outrun the image their own words had summoned. On Sundays, enslaved people from smaller farms who passed near Ashford carried fragments of stories to other quarters. The tale was passed from mouth to mouth in the dim candlelight of cabins. Samuel had gone to the big house, Samuel had not returned, and the master's son now walked with strength that did not seem to belong to him. No one had seen a body, no one had been allowed to bury him. That, more than anything, convinced them the whispers were close to the truth. Back at Ashford, life tried to resume its rhythm. The field still needed tending. Tobacco still needed cutting, curing, and packing. Meals still needed cooking. Boots still needed mending. But under every ordinary action there was a new tension, silent, coiled, and watching. Esther moved through her days as if underwater, slow, precise, detached. She did her work, obeyed orders, answered when spoken to. At night, when Ruth was finally asleep, she sat on the side of the narrow bed and stared at the wall, listening to the sound she could not escape. From the main house porch, when the night was very still, she could hear it, a slow, steady rhythm under the quiet. William sometimes sat outside after supper, a book in his lap, pretending to read. The night air was thick with the hum of insects and the distant croaking of frogs. But beneath it all, when he shifted or stood, when the world fell silent for a moment, Esther heard the faint thud of a heart she recognized. It was an illusion, of course. No one could truly hear a heart beating at that distance. But she felt it all the same, in her chest, in her throat, in the hollow place where Samuel's presence had been. One evening, as the sun bled out behind the trees, William came down the steps of the porch and crossed the yard toward the quarters. It was unusual for him to come that way alone. Most white members of the Hargrove family stayed near the main house, unless business drew them elsewhere. But William walked with purpose, his hand unconsciously resting over the scar on his chest. He stopped a few yards from Esther, who was rinsing clothes in a large wooden tub. Ruth played in the dust at her feet, drawing lines with a stick. "Esther," William said quietly. She did not look up at first. "Yes, Master William." He faltered, the practiced phrases his father had taught him draining away. The apology he wanted to offer caught in his throat. There was no word in his language that did not sound small and hollow against what had been done. "I wanted to see if you and Ruth had everything you need." "We get by," she answered, still focused on the tub. Her voice carried no anger, no warmth, nothing he could hold on to. It was flat stone. Ruth looked up at him. She was 4 now, narrow-faced and watchful. "Mama says Daddy's with God," she said. "Is that where he is, Master William?" The question cut through him like a blade. William crouched slowly, until he was eye-level with the child. Samuel's heart beat hard in his chest, as if it recognized what lay in front of it. "Yes," he said softly. "Your father was a good man. If there is a place with God, that's where he would be." Ruth considered that, then nodded once, accepting it in the simple way children often did. She went back to her drawing, unconcerned with theology, so long as she believed her father was somewhere safe. William rose and met Esther's eyes. For a brief, unguarded second he saw everything there. Grief like an open wound, rage buried so deep it had turned to steel, and something else he couldn't name. Not forgiveness, not yet. Perhaps not ever. But the smallest recognition that he, too, lived under a weight he had not chosen. "Is there anything at all I can do for you?" he asked. She let the question hang between them, dripping like water from the linens in her hands. Finally she said, "Give him back." The words were calm, almost gentle. They shattered him more completely than if she had screamed. "I can't," William whispered. "I know," Esther replied. "So there ain't nothing you can do." He left without another word. Inside the main house, Nathaniel watched from an upstairs window. He had seen his son walk toward the quarters and had almost gone down to stop him, then forced himself to let the moment happen. William needed to face the cost of his survival. Shielding him from it would only turn ignorance into cruelty. That night, father and son ate in near silence. "You shouldn't go down there alone," Nathaniel said at last, pushing his food around his plate. It confuses things for them and for you." William looked up, his expression hollow. "They are the ones who are owed clarity, not us." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "You think I don't know what I owe? I live with it every time I hear your heart beating. I know exactly what I did." "You made a calculation," William said quietly. "One life for another, a man for a son, a slave for an heir." "I saved my child," Nathaniel answered. "If that is a sin, it is one every father in this county would commit if given the chance." "That doesn't make it less of a sin," William replied. The words hung between them like smoke that would not clear. In Charlottesville, the rumors grew teeth. A free black man who worked as a porter at the tavern overheard a drunk planter mention hearts and knives, and that mad doctor at Ashford. The porter carried the story to the small black community at the edge of town, where free people and those still enslaved under hiring agreements gathered on Sundays. They had long known that white doctors used black bodies for dissection and practice, but this was different. This was new. This was a white man cutting out a living heart to save a white son. Within weeks, Ashford Plantation was no longer just another place on the road. It was a story, a warning, a symbol. For some, it was proof of white medical advancement. For others, it was proof that their bodies were never safe, not even from those who called themselves healers. Inside the Hargrove house, life narrowed to something tight and brittle. Nathaniel buried himself in his medical journals, pretending his silence was prudence rather than cowardice. William walked the property restlessly, a young man with an old man's burden. Esther worked, waited, and learned to live with the sound of her husband's stolen heart, echoing faintly, endlessly, somewhere she could never reach. The surgery had saved a life. It had also set something in motion that none of them could stop. The first open challenge came from the pulpit. In early September, Reverend Josiah Clark, who led the small Episcopal church attended by many local planters, stepped into his Sunday sermon with a different sort of fire. He had heard the same rumors as everyone else. He had visited Ashford once since the surgery, noticing how William's color had improved, how his walk had strengthened. He wasn't a physician, but he understood miracles, and he understood fear. What he saw at Ashford held none of the former and too much of the latter. His sermon began as they always did, with scripture with familiar cadences about sin and redemption. But then his tone shifted. "There are lines," he said, his voice carrying through the wooden sanctuary, "that even a fallen man must not cross. Authority over another's body, granted by law or custom, does not equal authority over his soul. We are stewards, not gods. When a man begins to treat human flesh as spare parts for his own, he trespasses in a territory that does not belong to him. No names were spoken. They didn't need to be. Every head in the room turned almost as one toward Nathaniel and William Hargrove, sitting stiffly 3 pews from the front. William's jaw clenched, his chest tightened. Samuel's heart beat harder, faster, as if it understood what was being said. Nathaniel sat perfectly still, his expression carved from stone, but a muscle flickered in his cheek. After the service, conversations broke like waves on the steps outside. Some men grumbled that Clark had gone too far, meddling in matters he didn't understand. Others, quieter and more cautious, admitted that something about the whole business at Ashford felt wrong, like a sore that wouldn't stop throbbing. One man, a neighboring planter named Richard Ellis, approached Nathaniel directly. "Doctor," Ellis said, keeping his voice low but not low enough to prevent others from hearing, "we've been friends a long time. You patched up my leg when I took that fall off the gelding. You delivered both my girls, so I'll ask this as a friend. Did you do what they're saying you did?" Nathaniel met his gaze. For a moment, William thought his father might tell the truth, just lay it bare and let whatever came come. Instead, Nathaniel chose a middle path. "My son was dying," he said. "I did everything in my power to save him." Ellis studied him. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I'm prepared to give," Nathaniel replied. From that day on, the Hargroves' place in the community shifted. They were still invited to dinners, still greeted in town, still treated with the thin, polite respect owed to their wealth and position. But there was hesitation now. Conversation stopped when they approached and resumed in a different key after they passed. Some patients found new doctors. A few sent notes cancelling long-standing accounts at the practice in Charlottesville. In the quarters, the shift was sharper. The enslaved people at Ashford had always lived with the knowledge that their bodies were property. But knowledge is one thing. Proof is another. Samuel's disappearance, William's miraculous recovery, and the whispers that now reached them from town hardened something in them. They went about their work with outward obedience, but a quiet defiance began to grow beneath the surface. One evening, as dusk settled and the fields emptied, an older man named Isaiah gathered a few of the enslaved workers behind one of the barns. Isaiah had been born in Africa and taken as a child. His memories of that stolen home were fragments now, worn at the edges, but still sharp enough to cut. "You see what they'll do," Isaiah said, his voice rough but steady. "You see it plain. They'll take your back, your hands, your children, your blood. Now they'll take your insides too if it suits them. There ain't no place they won't go." "What can we do?" a younger man asked. "Run? Where?" "North's far, and patrollers all over." "We can't change what was done to Samuel," Isaiah replied, "but we can remember it right, tell it true. Make sure nobody ever forgets what this place is." Esther listened from the shadows, Ruth asleep against her shoulder. She didn't speak, but she absorbed every word. Remember it right. Tell it true. The ideas lodged in her like seeds waiting for the right season. Inside the main house, Nathaniel and William faced their own reckoning. One night, after too much brandy, Nathaniel took out the locked journal where he had recorded every step of the surgery. He laid it on the table between them. "If anything happens to me," he said, his voice unsteady, "this will tell you what I did. How I did it. You'll be able to take this further than I could." "I don't want it," William said. "You may not have a choice," Nathaniel replied. "The body fails. Even with a good heart. One day I'll be gone, and you'll have to decide whether this knowledge dies with us or goes on." "Should it go on?" William asked. "You've done it once. You know what it costs. Would you do it again? To another man? To another family?" Nathaniel stared at the journal. His hands trembled. "I don't know." "You knew when it was my life on the table," William said. "You didn't hesitate. That was different." "It was not different," William answered quietly. "It was simply closer." The arguments continued in variations over the following weeks. Nathaniel clung to the idea that what he had achieved could one day be separated from the brutal system that had enabled it. William saw more clearly that the two were bound together, that the surgery's possibility rested on a foundation of absolute power over black bodies. One humid night in late September, everything shifted again. A traveling abolitionist lecturer came through Charlottesville, speaking in a private home to a small group who dared invite him. His words, relayed the next day by a frightened domestic servant, included a story from the North, a rumor from Virginia of a doctor using a slave's organs to save his own child. Whether he had heard of Ashford or not, no one could say. Rumors bent and tangled on the road, but the shape was familiar enough to those who listened. Now the story existed beyond the county, beyond the state line. It had slipped its leash. Nathaniel learned of this 2 days later, through a patient who mentioned it nervously, watching the doctor's face as he spoke. When the man left, Nathaniel locked himself in his study and stared at his hands, at the instruments on his shelves, at the journal in its drawer. He had meant to save one life. Instead, he had birthed a story no one could fully control. The breaking point came from where no one expected it. Through everything, the whispers, the sermons, the shifting looks in town, one person had remained almost entirely silent, Esther. She had not shouted, had not pleaded, had not gone to anyone outside Ashford with what she knew. Her grief had been a private flame, burning low and steady rather than flaring outward. People mistook that quiet for acceptance. They were wrong. In late October, the air cooled, leaves browned and loosened. Harvest neared completion, and Ashford prepared for winter. Ruth, now old enough to sense what adults tried to hide, began asking different questions. "Why did they take Daddy?" she asked one night as Esther braided her hair by candlelight. "Why didn't he get to stay with us?" Esther's fingers paused. For months she had given simple answers: sickness, God's will, things the child could hold without breaking. But Ruth was older now, and the story they were all living in had begun to grow beyond them. If Esther did not name it honestly, others would reshape it into something that excused the crime. "They took him because they could," Esther said at last. "Because in this place, men with money and paper say they own us. They say our lives ain't ours." "Does Master William have Daddy's heart?" Ruth asked. The words landed with a weight far too large for such a small voice. "Yes," Esther said. "He does." Ruth turned that over in her mind, then asked, "Does Daddy still love us if his heart is over there?" "He loved you with more than his heart," Esther answered. "Love ain't meat. They can't take that." Ruth nodded slowly, accepting that in the tentative way only a child could. But the conversation reshaped something in Esther. She realized that as long as the truth lived only in her chest and in whispers among the quarters, it could be dismissed as rumor, as superstition. To protect her daughter's future, she needed the story to exist in a form that could not be so easily erased. A week later, a stranger arrived at the Ashford gate. He was a white man in his 30s, dressed more plainly than most planters, with ink stains on his fingers and a small satchel over his shoulder. He introduced himself to the overseer as Daniel Avery, a writer from Richmond working on accounts of rural medical practice. He had heard, he said, of Dr. Hargrove's reputation and hoped to interview him for a discreet pamphlet to be circulated among physicians. The overseer hesitated, but eventually allowed him up to the house. Nathaniel received him in the parlor, guarded but curious. Fame still tempted him, even wrapped in risk. They spoke for hours. Avery asked intelligent questions about pre-war medical training, about the use of chloroform, about the challenges of surgery far from major cities. He made notes quickly, nodding with genuine interest. Only once did he approach the forbidden topic. "There are stories," Avery said carefully, "of remarkable recoveries. Cases where men thought doomed have somehow been restored. Have you seen anything like that here, Doctor?" Nathaniel's throat tightened. "My son was ill," he said. "He improved. Rumors love to make more of such things than there is." Avery held his gaze, then let the subject drop. When he left that afternoon, everyone in the house believed the visit had been contained. Everyone except the kitchen maid who had listened from the doorway. Her name was Lottie, a slight young woman with sharp ears and a better memory than most gave her credit for. She had caught enough of the conversation to understand who the visitor was and what he did. That night, in the close darkness of the quarters, she told Esther, "He writes things down," Lottie said. "Prints 'em. Sends 'em out. If he wanted to, he could put any story in the world on paper." Esther lay awake for a long time after the others slept, staring at the rough planks of the ceiling. Paper. Ink. Things that lasted longer than breath or rumor. If the truth of what had happened to Samuel lived only in voices, white men could talk around it, over it, until it wore down to nothing. But if it lived on paper, if it left the county, it might survive them all. 2 days later, when Nathaniel rode into Charlottesville for his usual clinic hours, Esther made a decision. She watched from the shadow of a shed as Avery returned to the area, staying in a boarding house on the edge of town. He had said he'd be around for a week, speaking with other physicians and apothecaries. That gave her a narrow window. Esther asked for permission to take a small cart into town to buy salt and molasses, things the plantation occasionally obtained from a particular merchant. The overseer, seeing nothing unusual in the request, granted a pass for the day. She brought Ruth with her, both to justify the errand and because she refused to leave her child behind. In town, the air felt different, tighter and yet somehow more open. There were more eyes, more rules, more danger, but also more cracks in which truth could slip. Esther asked a question here, another there, until she found the boarding house. She waited until Avery stepped out alone, notebook in hand, headed toward the river to walk and think. She followed at a distance, then stepped onto the path ahead of him, Ruth's hand in hers. "Mr. Avery," she said. He blinked, surprised. "Do I know you?" "No, sir, but you know the doctor at Ashford." His face shifted. "You're from the plantation?" "Yes, sir. My name is Esther. My husband's name was Samuel." The past tense landed heavily. Avery studied her, weighing caution against curiosity. "What do you want from me?" "Esther?" "Just this," she said. "You came looking for stories about doctors and what they do. I got a story. You can write it or throw it away. But you're gonna hear it." Ruth stood silent beside her, clutching her skirt. On the path by the water, with autumn leaves drifting around them, Esther told him everything. Not in the overheated language of rumor, but in the steady, measured detail of someone who had lived each step. Samuel being summoned, the examination, the change in his manner when he returned that last night, his final walk to the house, the weeks after, William's impossible recovery, the conversations half overheard, the way white folks' whispers matched what the enslaved already knew. Avery listened without interrupting, his pen occasionally moving, his face growing paler with each new piece. When she finished, he asked only one question. "Why tell me?" "Because you can't unhear it," Esther said. "Because if you put it down right, maybe one day somebody somewhere will know we weren't just bodies they used. We had names, we mattered, my husband mattered." Avery looked at Ruth, then back at Esther. "If I write this, it could bring trouble to you." "Trouble's already here," she replied. "Only choice I got is whether the truth dies with us or not." He didn't give her a promise. He didn't say he would publish it. He only nodded slowly and walked back toward town, his notebook heavier than when he'd left. That night, in a cramped rented room, he began to write. He changed names, blurred locations, disguised identifying details. But at the center of the account, he left one thing sharp, the reality of a man whose heart had been taken without consent to save the son of the man who owned him. The story of Samuel crossed a line that even Avery had not intended to cross when he set out from Richmond, but once heard, it would not leave him. On the plantation, Esther returned to her cabin and said nothing about what she'd done. She tucked Ruth into bed and lay down beside her, listening in the dark. Through the open window, very faintly, she heard a young white man's footsteps on the porch of the big house, and beneath them, the steady beat that had once lulled her to sleep. It sounded, she realized, less like comfort now, and more like a drum. Something had begun that none of them could yet name. The story did not explode. It seeped. Months later, far from Virginia, a slim pamphlet appeared in certain circles, printed quietly and circulated hand to hand. Its anonymous author described a Southern physician who had performed an unthinkable experiment, taking the heart of an enslaved man to save his own son. The account avoided dates and names, but its detail made it hard to dismiss as pure invention. In Boston, It was read in abolitionist meetings as evidence of slavery's moral rot. In Philadelphia, a few radical medical students argued over its plausibility late into the night, some insisting no surgeon could do such a thing, others pointing to recent advances and saying, if not now, then soon. In Richmond, a copy reached a small group of doctors who scoffed publicly while marking certain technical passages with a private, uneasy respect. Back in Albemarle County, no one spoke openly of the pamphlet, but hints of it reached Nathaniel nonetheless, an offhand remark from a colleague, a phrase that matched his own procedure too precisely to be coincidence. He secured a copy through a friend and read it alone in his study. The framework was altered, the geography blurred, but the core was unmistakable. Someone had told. He closed the pamphlet and sat motionless, listening to the sounds of the house, the clatter of dishes in the kitchen, the creak of floorboards above as William moved from room to room, the faint rustle of wind against glass. Outside, the fields lay brown and stubbled under a grey winter sky. For the first time since the surgery, Nathaniel understood that his control over the event had been an illusion. He had controlled the instruments, the bodies, the sequence of steps. But he had never controlled the meaning. That belonged to everyone who lived in the shadow of what he'd done. He went upstairs and found William sitting by the window, a book unopened in his lap. "You've seen it," William said without turning. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Do they name us?" "No. They changed enough that the world won't know it's us. Not yet." "But they'll recognize themselves," William said. "The ones who do things like this. The ones who've thought about it and lacked only the courage or the cruelty. They'll know what's possible now." Nathaniel had no answer. He looked at his son, the color in his cheeks, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the life that had stretched out before him, only because another man's life had been cut short. "I can't change what I did," Nathaniel said. "If I could go back to that morning, knowing everything I know now—" He stopped, unable to finish. "You would still choose me," William said quietly. "That's the truth you can't say." Nathaniel's silence confirmed it. Below, in the quarters, the pamphlet did not arrive. No paper carried Esther's story back to her, but traces of it returned in another form. A free black laborer from town, who sometimes worked with Isaiah on nearby farms, mentioned hearing a story in a colored church about a man whose heart was stolen to save his master's son. There were arguments over details, over locations, over names, but the shape had traveled. Isaiah repeated it by the fire one night, turning it gently so those listening would recognize what was theirs, while understanding how stories grow legs. "They'll tell it as something that proves how wicked this system is," he said, staring into the flames. "They'll use it for their speeches and their papers. Maybe that'll help end it sooner, maybe not, but we're going to tell it different here." "How?" a young woman asked. "As proof that even when they take what beats inside us, we still ain't gone," Isaiah said. "That man's heart's up there in that big house, but his name's still down here with us. They can use our bodies. They don't get to decide what our lives mean." Ruth sat close to the fire, listening. She was old enough now to understand that her father had become more than a memory. He had become a story, one people carried on their tongues, shaped with their own pain and hope. It didn't bring him back. It didn't put food on the table or erase the ache in Esther's face, but it meant he had not vanished. That mattered. Life at Ashford moved forward, pulled along by seasons and obligations. Harvests came and went. New children were born. Old people died. Talk of secession began to drift through planter gatherings, the first hints of a storm still years away. William learned to live with the dual weight in his chest, the physical thump of Samuel's heart and the invisible burden of what it represented. He never became a doctor. The idea, once his father's quiet hope turned sour in him. Instead, he took over more of the estate's management, as Nathaniel's health slowly declined. Age and guilt worked on the doctor together, wearing him down with a thoroughness no illness could match. On certain evenings, when the air was neither hot nor cold, and the light slanted just so across the yard, William would stand on the back porch and watch the people who worked his land. He knew their names now, more of them than he had as a boy. He knew their family connections, their strengths, their injuries. He knew, better than most white men of his station, that every life moving out there was entire and complete, not an interchangeable part. Sometimes he caught Esther's eye across the distance. There was no friendship there, no comfort. But over the years, the raw hatred cooled into something else, a grim acknowledgement that they were bound together in a way neither had chosen. She could not look at him without seeing the theft that kept him standing. He could not look at her without feeling the debt that could never be paid. They spoke rarely. When they did, it was about practical matters: Ruth's work assignments, extra cloth needed for winter, an injury that required attention. They did not speak of Samuel. They did not need to. His absence filled every space between their words. Time ensured that nothing remained exactly as it had been. Ruth grew into a young woman, her face an echo of both parents. She carried her father's name in quiet ways, written on the inside of a ragged hymn book she borrowed for Sunday gatherings, whispered into the ear of a younger child, asking why some people had no fathers at all. Nathaniel died before the war, his journals sealed and left to his son with no instructions. William read them once, slowly, feeling each line like a blade drawn across old scars. Then he wrapped them in oilcloth and hid them in a place only he knew. Years later, long after emancipation, long after the fields at Ashford grew wild from neglect, pieces of those records would surface, fragments preserved by chance, by curiosity, by the stubborn way paper sometimes outlives its makers. Historians would argue over their meaning. Surgeons would marvel at the crude brilliance of the technique. Some would call Nathaniel a visionary. Others would call him a butcher. The arguments would never fully resolve. But none of them would know the sound of Ruth asking if her father still loved her. None would feel the weight of Esther's gaze on the boy, whose chest rose and fell with a stolen rhythm. None would understand the quiet decision made by a woman with no legal power, who chose to tell her story to a man with a pen. Out in the world, people would say that a heart taken from a slave beat on in another chest, and in that way still beats today. A phrase used for speeches, for books, for shock. In Virginia, those who remembered differently would say that Samuel's heart had never truly left them. Its flesh might have been moved. Its meaning stayed where it began. On the land where it all happened, the house would one day sag, then fall. The quarters would rot back into the soil. Names would fade from stones or never reach them at all. But the story, passed from tongue to tongue, from page to page, would remain, not as a miracle, as a ledger, one life taken, one life extended, a debt written not on paper but in the breathing years that followed, a reminder that every cut a man makes into another's body writes something permanent on his own. And somewhere in that quiet accounting, the truth of 1852 refused to die. Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.